Welcome back! We just went over 8 different types of studies in health research, each with their own goals, advantages, and limitations. It may seem overwhelming to have so many options. How do you choose the best one? There are actually many factors to consider, and when you become an experienced researcher and an expert in your field of study, the approaches kind of choose you, based on what you're best at and the types of questions you tend to ask. For now, we can focus on 4 major factors to consider when choosing a research approach, in no particular order. One thing to consider is the availability and the source of the data. Usually, researchers talk about data sources in terms of primary, secondary, and tertiary sources. Primary sources refer to new data collected from individuals, like in case series, cohort studies, experimental studies, and actually most of the other study types. This involves a lot of work, but also affords you more control of the type and quality of the data that you are getting. Secondary sources refer to data that are already available, usually from a previous study that you or someone else conducted, or from a publicly available database. The research approach that is most tied to secondary sources is the correlational or ecological study, which examines population-level data. Using secondary data sources saves you time because you don't have to collect new data, but you are limited to the variables that exist, and you have less control over how the data were collected. Often, this is totally fine because the existing data are sufficient to answer ecological research questions, but you have to make sure of this before you start and see what variables exist. Tertiary data refer to data that not only already exist, but were already analyzed and published as studies. The research approach that uses tertiary data the most is in the review or meta-analysis. But like I mentioned when we went over this research approach, chances are that someone has already published a good review or meta-analysis if the topic is interesting enough. So I really wouldn't count on doing a study using tertiary data as a general rule. Another factor to consider is study duration. Does your study question require a quick answer, either because the matter is urgent, for example, if you want to study the effects of Zika infection, or because the problem is new or rare enough that you want to just get some basic answers out there as fast as possible? For example, maybe a new recreational drug is starting to become popular in a certain population, and you want to be able to describe its neurological effects. In these cases, it's better to go for a quicker study, such as a cross-sectional survey, a review, a correlational study, or a case series. Just know that although these approaches tend to provide nice snapshots and overviews, they are less able to inform causation because they are not experimental and they cannot tell us about long-term information. However, if you are willing and able to wait longer for your answers, perhaps because the nature of your study question has to do with long-term outcomes, you can conduct one of the slower study types, such as cohort or experimental studies. Usually these study types give you more control and power to design your study and produce more knowledge, especially about causation and long-term effects. Another major consideration is the main focus of your study question. Is the main target of the research question the exposure, the disease, or the population? For example, if you are most interested in identifying exposures that, say, increase risk for Alzheimer's disease, you would want to conduct a cohort or case control study, which prospectively and retrospectively look for culprit exposures. If you're more interested in describing a disease itself, such as, say, microcephaly in infants born from Zika-infected mothers, you will conduct a more disease-focused study, such as case series. If you want to understand exposures or disease in a specific population, for example, if you want to know the prevalence of e-cigarette use among teenagers, you will conduct a more population-focused study, such as a correlational study. You'll notice that some of the study types, such as experimental studies and qualitative studies, are not mentioned here. That's because they are quite versatile and can focus on exposures, disease, or populations. The ones mentioned on this slide too actually are also flexible in their focus and their roles. These are merely suggestions, not iron-bound rules. For example, a cohort study could also be used to focus on a specific population, or a case series can also help to identify exposures. Another important consideration is the current state of the knowledge on your topic. Do we already know a lot about a disease, exposure, or population? Or are they new to us or just not very well studied? If we already know a lot, any new studies on the topic would seek to synthesize the knowledge. So you'd be doing a review or a meta-analysis. Or the new study needs to contribute something truly novel, say by testing a new hypothesis or intervention that would substantially contribute to what we already know. In other words, the bar is pretty high, so I would recommend more along the lines of experimental studies and cohort studies. On the other hand, if we don't know that much yet about the topic, your goal may be to describe a population, a disease, or exposure just to give the scientific community some basic understanding. In this case, you can use qualitative studies to describe how a group of people think about exposures or diseases, or perhaps use a case series approach to describe the symptoms of a new disease, or perhaps use a case control study to explore possible culprit exposures for a disease. The move here is to build up enough foundational knowledge so that you or other researchers can design more in-depth studies in the future. So to summarize and review this module, there are 8 general research approaches and a handful of factors to consider when choosing one for answering your specific research question. The 8 types of studies are review and meta-analysis, correlational or ecological study, case series, cross-sectional survey, case control study, cohort study, experimental study, or qualitative study. At least some basic considerations when choosing one of these approaches include the availability and source of the data, the study duration that you're willing to conduct, the main focus of your research question, whether it be an exposure, a disease, or a population, and also, importantly, the current state of knowledge on your topic. So hopefully this will help you to design your study approach. Your assignment 3 is to lay out the methods for your proposed study, which begins with choosing the general approach. So use the worksheet provided in the module to complete assignment 3. I also highly recommend you read the sample research proposals posted to this module and also in Module 0. These are successful student proposals that were funded by their college, so you know they are well written. Okay, best of luck to getting started.